About 35 years ago, God began preparing me for this workshop. I was 33 years old. I was a secular agnostic who thought everything in life was either a nasty or happy accident. And at the time that I turned 33, it was one big nasty accident. My life came completely apart. I actually considered for a day suicide. I'm not the suicidal type. The very thought that had crossed my mind scared me so bad that I asked a stepbrother of mine who had gotten saved at Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa in California during the Jesus People revivals. I asked him what was going on at his church. It knocked him off his chair almost. He had been praying for me for 2 years and fasting for me for a solid week. And that's how the end of his fasting came, was me asking him what was going on at his church. And that night I became a Christian. And I began to take in the gospel wholesale. I went to this was a big church. Those of you familiar with the Jesus People revivals in the 70s in California will know what Calvary Chapel is all about, baptizing thousands at the beach. And I was just one of hundreds that had come to Christ that week at the church. And they had Bible studies going morning, noon, and night. And I went to every one of them, including the women's studies. Actually, it was some of the best teachers. I'd sit in the back of the audience. For me, it was a whole new worldview. I was going from happy accident to the realization that God was in control of everything. So soon afterwards, I'd been a newspaper man. My work started out in journalism, newspaper work. It was a craft then. Today they call it a profession. But, just a storyteller. And the rescue mission in Orange County, those of you who know what a rescue mission is, it's an inner city mission, sometimes called soup kitchens. Ours had housing and New Life program eventually and other things. But the rescue mission in Orange County needed a photograph taken and a slideshow developed. And someone who knew me and knew the director of the mission and knew that I was a newspaper man, asked if I would go to the rescue mission and take a photograph so they could apply for the Disneyland Community Service Award. And so I went down there. I'd never been to a rescue mission. This was a really nasty place in a nasty part of town, and it was a really poor mission and had one 60-watt light bulb hanging from the center of the room, and some of the most unsavory characters Orange County had hanging out there. So I got in there, took my photograph, and was booking my way out of there, and this big old meat hook lands on my shoulder and says, "Son, I want to talk to you." And it was a 6'5" black man, Marine sergeant, who had started the mission, and he pulls me into his office, towers over me, and says, "God needs you." And that was a revelation to me. Everything was a revelation to me. And he said, could I come and take some pictures and create a slideshow for him so he could take it out and do deputation in the local churches. And it was something I knew how to do. I had absolutely nothing else to do. I was a complete wreck of a human being on the path of getting healthy. And so the next day I came back in the morning and started taking pictures all over this small rescue mission out on the street and such. And about halfway through the afternoon, the staff of the mission, I use this word advisedly, the staff was guys that had come off the street, some just a few days ago, some a few months ago, and they did the cooking and the looking after the dormitory and that sort of thing. And the mission didn't have commercial refrigeration. It had a bunch of ice boxes, the kind before automatic defrosting, all around this room with zip cords going everywhere and this noise like you've never heard. And each one of them full of ice, and in the middle would be a piece of meat or something, and they'd go through. They had about 20 of them. And they went through everything, and they realized, and this is midday, that they didn't have any food for dinner that night. And so I'm kind of watching this and observing these guys. And so they get into a circle, big circle, and they begin to pray. And they pull me into the circle. I'd never prayed out loud in my life. I'm just a couple of weeks old in the Lord. And it was one of these Pentecostal pumping prayers where you get a hold of the hands and you go, oh, God, oh, God. And by this point, I'm completely sideways with this whole thing, and I'm oh, God, and right along with them. And they're saying, we need food. It was a simple prayer, we need food. And while they were praying that, there was this on the front door of the mission. I'm a journalist, and I'm telling you the story exactly like it happened. Right while they were praying, there's this banging on the door, insistent banging on the door. So they stop praying, they go to the door, and at the door is a guy that came up to about here on me with a cigar in his mouth in the biggest Cadillac I'd ever seen, and a loud sport coat, and he looks at the guys and says, can you use some frozen steak dinners? Seriously. And I'm going nuts. I can't believe this has actually happened. They're praying for food, and some guy who looks like a clown out of a movie has just shown up with a bunch of steak dinners. And I'm literally, my mind's blown, and I'm going nuts. And the guys were, they were just matter of fact about it. And he was a frozen food salesman, and these were samples, and they were going bad, and instead of throwing them away, he had decided to give it to the poor to eat. And so he found them in the phone book. The story did two things for me. One, it showed me God's real and active. Two, prayer counts for something. And three, these guys had expectation that God was going to, they prayed actually believing that was actually going to work. It was a brand new concept to me. That's where I learned fundraising. I don't want anybody in here to think that fundraising to me is a set of techniques. It's all about faith and excellence. So we're going to talk about excellence a lot over the next 2 days, but it's faith that we start with and faithfulness. And we're going to learn how to be faithful in being fundraisers. Okay, so that was my first story. My second story was about 6 months later. I'm back to health. I'm sort of getting along in my life again. And I got a couple of jobs, and I got my first paycheck. So 6 months after my life had collapsed, and now I'm coming back to health. And I got a paycheck for $600. And I'm looking at the paycheck, and although I had not been taught stewardship, I knew I was supposed to give 10% of this check to God. And I didn't want to. I started focusing on the $60. I'd never given anything to anybody without expecting something in return. And I'm going to give $60 to God. I forgot about the $540. And I just got totally focused on that $60. It undid me. I took a walk around the streets of Santa Ana, California for hours fussing with that $60. The question I was actually dealing with was, are you real? Is God real? That was the question. Because in my little brain, if he wasn't real, why would I give him $60? I mean, yeah, I understand the church needs to turn on the lights and the pastor needs his salary, but that's fine. The other folks can do that. But are you real? If you're real, it's all yours. If you're not real, what a bunch of foolishness. And so my 3 or 4 hours of walking the streets of Santa Ana that day was me wrestling with that question. Are you real? 6 months after getting saved. Jesus was my healer. I was like the blind man in John, wandering around. Suddenly I've got sight, and I'm telling everybody I've got sight. Who did it? I haven't a clue, but I can see. And I was more that blind man than anything, not a real clue about Jesus. And that $600, that $60 is what brought me into the real question, are you real? And at the end of the day, I said, you're real. It's all yours. All of that stewardship that we all know, probably have all taught, have all wrestled with ourselves, came into me in those hours of that day and prepared me for this day to be with you. The point of this story is I decided he was real. I also believe that was the day I became a disciple. That was the day I acknowledged his sovereignty over me and my utter dependence on him. I began to realize my very breath that I was breathing was his. That everything I saw, things that weren't mine and things that were his. That the food I was eating, I used to think, why would I pray over a meal that I earned? And since then, I haven't failed to pray over a meal. And I gave the $60 cheerfully. And I haven't stopped giving since then. The point of the story for us here, the thing that I want you to understand when you're doing fundraising is you're making disciples. In some of your settings where people don't give, where, oh, we're too poor, or we have no tradition of giving, this is the very thing that makes disciples. You want to be a disciple maker, start with what they have. And does God own it, no matter who they are? And we're going to go through that over the next 2 days. We have to shift a mindset about fundraising. It is not begging, not in God's kingdom. It's about offering. You all are on the front lines of God's work. If you're not directly there, you're working with the folks that are directly there to help them flourish in their callings. You're training, you're partnering, you're doing the work yourself. That is where the kingdom's expansion is happening, where God's church is going into places where it hasn't gone before. We can go through, and if we were to talk about each one of your stories as it relates to kingdom expansion into the places where it hasn't gone before, our hair would be standing on end by the end of this week as we went through each of your stories. Because that's where investments in God's kingdom are producing results. And I want you for a moment to think of fundraising as an investment strategy and you as an investment broker. This isn't about your money, even though it might pay for your groceries and your rent. It's about what's going to be accomplished. That's what the donor's interested in. Now, the one exception to that is some personal fundraising is about you. You know, when you're sent from a church, generally we all know Chris. Chris is a good guy. You know, we'll fund Chris. And Chris will come back and tell stories, and they'll go, they may not even know where the heck it is he's working. They may not even understand what it is he's doing, but it sounds interesting, and he wears odd-looking shirts when he tells the story, and it seems dramatic, and he's a good guy, and we're supposed to do this. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about offering people an opportunity to participate in God's work. Whether we're accomplishing that work or whether somebody else is accomplishing that work, we're part of that. We're part of God's enterprise, if I can use business language for just a moment. I don't mean to put temporal ideas on very spiritual ones, but fundraising is at root. The fundraising we do is at root a spiritual enterprise.